Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Maria Luisa Garnica, and I am the Education USA advisor in Guatemala City. It's a pleasure to be here today with you. Today we have the fourth session of our LL.M special of the year. We'll focus on personal statement tips, writing samples, and letters of recommendation. In the logistics element, please make sure to pay attention to the content, as many of your questions will be answered there. Otherwise, feel free to write your questions in the comment section and we'll address them at the end of our webinar. And then I will be sharing in the comment section as well the links to follow up and join the conversations with each of the reps individually. All right, so please, thank you everyone for joining us. Hannah, you can take over the slide sharing.
All right, thanks for joining us, everyone. We are today's Education USA webinar, like Maria Luisa said, personal statements, writing samples, letters of recommendation. We are the 9 law schools chosen to present about these topics. These are our logos for your reference. And then, like Maria Luisa said, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. Here is a little bit about how this presentation is going to go. We'll start general and then talk more about these 3 specific things that you'll want to include in your application packet, and then addressing some shortcomings if you're not confident about certain parts of your application.
With that, it's for me to speak a bit about the general. My name is Monica Caro. I'm from the Notre Law School in South Bend, Indiana. I'm a lawyer by trade, and I'm delighted to be here with you today to share a little bit about this process that you're about to embark upon. My university is a Catholic university with a great tradition, and we're going to roll right into it. It's going to be 5 quick minutes and turning it over to the next person. So, wonderful prospective students. It's so great that you've taken the time to join this webinar, because this is really the first signal that you're really preparing for this process, which can be a little bit daunting. It takes a lot of time and preparation, and I just want to encourage you and thank you for taking the time to devote to thinking about this process. So as you think about the process, the first thing I would want you to focus on is the planning. And really to think about how you're going to attack this process so that you can hit all of the deadlines and to be as successful with each of the parts that you're going to need to accomplish. The biggest piece of advice that I have to give to you is to not underestimate the amount of time that this process is going to take in these different steps. Start by looking at the deadlines. Work backwards from those with the different pieces that you're going to need to assemble, and make the assumption that things are going to take longer than you expect or that you hope, and things are not necessarily going to be perfectly smoothly in assembling all the pieces that you have to do. So start as early as possible. And again, how wonderful that you're here to start thinking about these. If I were you, I would be organizing a spreadsheet or some other Gantt chart or other way to organize all of the components that you're going to have that are required by each school. Track the different programs that you've already selected that you want to apply to, that you've learned about in other sessions. And then try to coordinate which elements of those proposals are going to be the same for different schools. Each school is going to have similar but different parts to the application. Some of them may be ones that you can adapt slightly between them. And so getting some sort of spreadsheet or chart that can help you structure your time and your organization is really going to help. The other thing is, at some point in this process, you're going to have questions, and we will be here at the end to answer particular questions you may have or throughout this. Again, please don't hesitate to put those in the chat. But I want to just highlight for a moment how to ask those questions. First of all, I would just encourage you to check the websites before you send an actual email to someone. Really try to Strengthen your application and your presence with these universities that you want to interact with by making sure that what you're asking is something that you need to be asking and isn't already out there. So just be aware of that your first impression to these universities and your professionalization, it's really a component of even these first preliminary interactions. If you don't already have a signature on your emails, I would encourage you to have not just your name, but perhaps your student affiliation or your professional affiliation, to just give some professional context to that email. So given these basic parameters, that's how you start. But let's turn to the next slide to look at the application components. As I mentioned, each of these universities will have slight variations on these, but these are common ones that you will see. Some sort of application form, which may be through LSAC, a fee, a resume that will need to be completed, transcripts, English proficiency scores or examination scores, letters of recommendation. Writing samples are less common. Interviews vary. And some of these are perhaps if there's some question about your application and the institution particularly wants to check on that, or your English proficiency, there may be an interview at that stage at the discretion of the committee. And then the personal statements. Personal statements are perhaps a really key component of that. And with that, I'm going to transition it to my next colleague who will be sharing more in detail.
Hi, my name is Maruja Keener. I'm the Assistant Director of Graduate Admissions at American University, Washington College of Law in Washington, D.C. And similar to all of you, I am Panamanian and was in your shoes a few years ago, making the decision of where to apply and embarking in this challenging process. I hold an LL.M in International Arbitration and Business Law from WCL, and I'll be talking about personal statements, what is it, and what to do. Anna, you can move to the next slide. So how do we define what is a personal statement? Something that is going to tell us so much information about you all. A personal statement is a carefully worded, detailed document that addresses who you are, both personally and professionally, discusses your short-term and your long-term goals, lets the reader know if you're a good fit for their institution. Next slide, please. So think before you write. Brainstorming is extremely important. What do you want to transmit the reader? Next slide, please. So word it carefully. Word choice matters. Use strong verbs, active voice, and strong topic sentences. Next slide, please. Address who you are personally and professionally. And I want to emphasize in this. We don't only want to know what you are professionally. We want to know who you are personally. We want to know what motivated you to study law, or what motivated you to opt for this particular practice area. Be unique. Next slide, please. Discuss your short-term and long-term goals. What are short-term goals? What are you planning to do immediately after you graduate? What are those hopes? How do you hope that this LL.M program is going to give you a better position to be in that particular job that you're seeking? And what are your long-term goals? How do you invest in yourself in 5 years? And be realistic, please, because being the president, we all want that, but it might not be as realistic as it is. So next slide, please. With that, I'm going to wrap it up, and I'm going to leave the floor to Boston University.
Thank you. My name is Maureen Leo from Boston University School of Law. Thank you for joining us to learn about personal statements, and I get to tell you what not to do. Next slide, please. So in determining what not to do, let me first say the first thing you absolutely must do is, next slide, edit, and then edit some more. And when you're sick of editing, keep going. Next slide. What should we consider first? Well, did you write your personal statement in one sitting? After you finished, did you take a break from it? Did you print out your personal statement? Did you read it out loud slowly? Did at least one other person review your personal statement? If not, your work is not done. Friends, you need to go back to the drawing table and get it perfect. Next slide. A note on perfection. You have a cell phone. I'm sure you post images of yourself and you see images taken and you think, oh, I don't like that picture. We are focused on perfection, inordinately so in our culture. I'm sure where you are and where we are in the United States, and we should stop that. We don't need to be perfect in most areas of our life, but in your personal statement, you must be. We expect personal statements to be 100% error-free. This is your statement about who you are and why you want to be where we are. Next slide, please. So how are you going to do that? Let's look at it. I'm very impressed with the faculty at Boston University School of Law because of their consistent rankings in U.S. News and World Reports. That's where I'm eager to begin my studies at American University in Washington College of Law in Chicago in the fall. Now, I'm at Boston University School of Law. I read this and I'm glad you know about our rank and about our school. And then you talk about how you want to go to American University. And then you've lost me, friends. You've lost me because you didn't edit and you haven't demonstrated to me that you're a good fit for BU. To make matters worse, you said that American University is in Chicago and it's in DC. Editing and accuracy is important. This is your version of who you are for the world. Now, you can and should apply to multiple schools. We know you're going to do that. You should do it. That's being a smart student consumer. But you must edit the personal statement, particularly in these last few paragraphs, or we will find it out. Next slide. Now, did you do your homework? Do you know what we're good at? Do you know what school you're applying to? Do you know what our curricular strengths are? Do you know what your strengths are that you want to market? If you want maritime law, don't talk about Boston University. We're not a good school for you. You should be at Tulane or another school that's great with maritime law. If you want international business or IP, those are some of our curricular strengths. All of the colleagues on the line here have schools that have particular areas of strength and focus. You need to determine what those are and how you fit with our school's profile. Next slide. Now, I put this slide as this big, bright picture, just to emphasize the most important takeaway of any of this isn't the importance of editing. It is so important to get this right because this tells us who you are. Now, at the end of the day, friends, what do we want to see from these personal statements? And if you could advance the slide, we want to find out who you are. We are looking for confident, mature, likable, talented, interesting people. You're here listening to this webinar. That means that you have a vision for yourself and what your future might be. You just need to tell us who that is and how you stand out amongst the crowd. We read a lot of these. So in that spirit, next slide, I'll take my own advice. Be bright, be brief, and be gone. Right? We read a lot of these. We read them quickly. Be honest, keep it interesting. Less is often more, but have this show us who you are and why you are where we are. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll gladly pass this over to my colleague.
Hello, everyone. My name is Olivera Jovanovic. I'm a recovering attorney from the University of San Francisco. We are a small private school in the heart of one of the best cities on the West Coast. Today, my colleague Mary Beth and I will be presenting on letters of recommendation. Mary Beth?
Thank you so much, Olivera. My name is Mary Beth Busby. I'm the Director of Graduate and International Program Admissions at Northwestern Pritzker School of Law. And I am here today to talk about letters of recommendation, or at least a portion of the letters of recommendation. So what are they? The technical definition of the letter of recommendation is that it's a formal letter that is included in support of an academic application. So that's very technical. And I think that that definition kind of belies or understates the importance of letters of recommendation in the evaluations process. Next slide. Letters of recommendation are useful because they give us a different perspective. Everything else in your application is from your perspective. Obviously, the personal statement, but also your transcript, your grades are your own, your English language proficiency test, and even your resume. However, the letters of recommendation give us insight into how other people think about you, and recommenders can give us information about your strengths and your accomplishments in a way that you can't without coming across as being egotistical or arrogant. So it really is great information about you as an applicant. Next slide. So what do they tell us? What do we learn from the letters of recommendation? Well, one of the most important things is about your communication skills. You know, we do have your personal statement, which gives us some information about your writing ability, but, you know, as Maureen said, you probably edited that and proofread it and had many people take a look at it. So the information that the recommenders give us is I guess, more accurate information about not just your writing skills, but also your oral or spoken English skills, your maturity, both professional and personal. How do you handle stress? How do you handle pressure? Those kinds of things are very useful to us. Your ability to work with others. A lot of what happens in the classroom in a U.S. law school involves working with a partner or in teams. So we can get information about your ability to work with others from these letters. Perseverance. This is an opportunity for somebody to tell us about obstacles or challenges that you've overcome, or how you react maybe when things are not going your way. That can certainly happen in law school. And then finally, strengths. We look for diversity in our students in all respects, you know, geographic diversity, diversity in terms of your academic interests and your work experience, but also in terms of your strengths, things like sense of humor, leadership skills. Are you a peacemaker? Do you have strong analytical skills? There's a place for all of these things in the law school classroom. And when we want to enroll classes of people that have different skills and attributes. So as you can see, with letters of recommendation, we're looking for detail, for specific examples. So this is why who you ask to write those letters are important. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Olivera to talk about who should write these letters for you. Olivera?
Thank you, Mary Beth. So the first thing you should do is take a look at the schools to which you're applying and make sure you really understand the requirements, because the application process varies school to school. So after you've figured out, generally there are two types of letters of recommendation that schools will accept, and that is the academic or the professional. The academic is coming from someone who supervised you as a professor, possibly, or in a experiential learning environment, maybe a clinic or another course that had a more skills or interactive focus. And the professional is somewhere where you worked for someone. Maybe you're an attorney who's had many years of experience. Maybe you did a clinic and had a supervising attorney who's not typically part of the faculty at your university, but can speak to those skills. The one additional thing I want to say is about title. We often get this question, should I go for the dean of my law school, someone with a very high-ranking, impressive title, or should I get a recommendation from a professor? And what we're really looking for is for someone that can really speak to the things that Mary Beth was just speaking about, who can really speak and give us specific examples about you and your strengths. We can always tell. We've read many letters of recommendation amongst us. I'm sure if we tallied the number, it would be mind-blowing, because we have a lot of experience on this call. We can easily tell when someone doesn't know you based on what they write about you and the depth of which their letter of recommendation goes into your skills and abilities. So titles are wonderful. And if you have someone who knows you well with a great title, fabulous. But I think that most of us would say, look for someone who can write about you in depth. Can we go to the next slide? Because I want to touch on 2 more points. How to ask for a letter of recommendation. I think it's really important that when you make the request, you do so either via Zoom or face-to-face. I think it's so important to look someone in the eye and get a sense of their comfort level writing you a letter of recommendation. Ask them what they want to support that request. If you've been in a large class, or it's been many years since you've been in school and you're looking for an academic letter, refreshing that professor's memory or providing them a resume about what to show what you've done since can help them support your request. And you can let them know if you're seeking one professional letter that they are your sole academic letter. Those are things that we feel it's okay to share with them so that they can really give us a letter that gives us some better sense of you. Next slide, please. Last thing I want to touch on is when my colleagues spoke about this process takes a lot longer than you anticipate. So keep in mind your application deadlines so that you can have your letters done and allow for a reasonable amount of time. When you make that ask, let that person know what you're looking for, but also ask them if that's reasonable. A rushed letter is never going to be a great letter. And if you're asking for multiple letters from the same person, that spreadsheet, that chart, something to show them the timelines and organize it for them is incredibly helpful, and they'll appreciate that very much. With that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, and thank you so much.
Hello, my name is Lori Capps. I'm manager of international and graduate law programs at the University of Miami School of Law. That incorporates the LL.M programs, SJD, intensive legal English, and international exchange programs. Next slide. I'm here to talk to you about resume and what to do on your resume. First of all, the resume is a formal timeline of everything that you've done for your past educational and professional experience. You really should focus it on what program you will be applying for. It is not a complete history of every single thing you have ever done academically and professionally. You really need to narrow it down and focus it towards the programs you're applying for. It's a great opportunity to really tailor it. A big thing to do and remember is when you are right at the very top of the resume, make sure that your name matches the name on your application. You should not have your formal name on your application and then on your resume put if your name's Maria Rosa Fernandez and then you usually go by Rosa, don't put just Rosa Fernandez on your resume, put your full name. Another thing, make sure you have good contact information, email, address, phone number, and the email, make sure that is a professional email. If you look at it and it's, just kind of a very casual email, or it has sort of a nickname to it, or it's not really professional, go ahead. If you're still a student, you can use your school email. If not, make a professional email address and put that on your resume and your application. In the resume, you also want to include your education history. Make sure you list your degrees, schools attended. You can include the dates of attendance. You also want to do relevant experience. This is things that are professional, internships. If you had leadership roles in your school or in the community, you can include volunteer, extracurricular activities, especially if they apply to the legal profession, the program you're applying to. For instance, if you're applying to a maritime program and you did something related to that, or with the environment, go ahead and include that. Also, if it provided service support to the community. You can include writing you did. You should not really include writing per se if it was like for a final exam for your program that you're in, but if you co-authored something that was published or you authored something that was published, you should include that also. Next slide. Another thing you should do is try to keep your resume to one page. There are a couple exceptions to this, most notably if you've been out of school for a while and you've been practicing for several years and you have a lot more professional content to include, then maybe it can go to a second page. Or if you have written a lot, you can go ahead and include that in a second page. But typically, you want to submit a resume that's just one page. You want to get the points that are really going to grab the interest of the person reading your application and looking at that resume, get their interest to find out more about you, highlight what your strengths are. They'll find more details about this in the personal statement. This is sort of what kind of grabs them and gives you the overall look at you professionally. On the resume, don't exceed a 12-point font. You don't, for lack of space or to make up for space, you don't want to make the font bigger or smaller. Try and stay around 12. Definitely do not go lower than 10. People are not going to read it. And proofread. Proofread for spelling, grammatical errors. One of the best things you can do is go ahead and put your resume together, proofread it, give it to someone else to proofread. After they've looked at it, just set it aside for a couple hours or a day, go back and look at it again with fresh eyes. And that's all I have for you. I'll turn it over to Duke.
Hi, thanks so much. My name is Jabrina Robinson. I'm the Assistant Dean of International Studies at Duke Law School in Durham, North Carolina. I'm very excited to speak with you all this evening and to answer your questions about Duke Law School, LL.M programs in general, and more specifically to talk right now about some things to avoid on your resume. So when you think about your resume, it's important to think of it as kind of a map of your career. And every inch of your resume is prime real estate that you really need to be thoughtful about what you want to highlight and what you omit so you optimize the space. So one of the things, the first things we highlight in different countries, photos are included on resume, but for US resumes, we do not include photos. We really want to use that space to focus on your professional and educational background. And, you don't want to be selected based upon your appearance or other more important factors. Again, kind of along the same line, there's no need to include personal data in your resume. Things like your birthday, your age, if you're married or not, your religion, if you have children, any mental or physical health issues. These are all matters that some are legally impermissible and others are already captured in other parts of your LL.M application. So really use your resume to highlight information about your educational and professional experiences, and this personal data should not be captured on your resume. Another item to think about and avoid when you're building your resume would be not including a job objective. Really, a job objective is more related to when you're applying for a job. And if you want to focus on kind of your future career goals, as kind of discussed earlier, that's really can be captured in your personal statement. I feel like I'm just going on things to avoid. And another item that we want to avoid are computer skills. It's 2022, so there's an expectation that all applicants are going to have basic computer skills. So there's no need to capture that information unless it's computer skills that are directly relevant to either your prior degree or your area of law, something like patent law, then that may be an exception to include some type of programming language or other computer information. One other item to avoid would be not capturing and including non-professional social media on your resume. You can include a link to your LinkedIn account on your resume, but again, any other type of social media should not be captured. Remembering that we really want to focus on your educational and your career goals. And as a quick kind of asterisk, reminding you that making sure that your social media, your publicly available social media is professional in all viewable aspects. Next slide. Some additional tips that I want to focus on. As we're already highlighted, your resume is really a chance to kind of highlight. So you don't need to write it in a narrative form. You really want to focus on using action words and really using an active voice as you're describing the things that you've done previously and being really thoughtful again on this map use of space. You don't need to have, I did this, I learned how to, again, just using the active words, researched, developed, drafted. That will help to make your resume really stand out and be easier to read. If there are any gaps of time that are unaccounted for on your resume or in your career, it's really helpful to go ahead and address those in your resume. If for some reason, maybe you took a sabbatical from work, then it's helpful to go ahead and capture that information and that gap on your resume so that we can have a full kind of linear understanding of what you've been doing. This was highlighted on personal statement. I think this is highlighted on everything. It's really important to error check. On the resume, we don't want to see any typos. We don't want to see any grammatical errors or spelling errors. So make sure that you're really taking the time to check it. I often will encourage people to physically print a copy of their resume. I know people don't like to print anymore, but when you physically print a copy of your resume and read it, you often will capture things that your eyes may autocorrect when you're looking at it on a screen. And again, you know, as you look at your resume, finally, is it visually pleasing? Are the margins so extended and the font so small that it's difficult for someone to read? You really want to have consistent formatting, margins, and line spacing that makes it easy for someone who may not be as young and sprightly as you reviewing the resume to be able to carefully read it. And also making sure that you have the right tense, verb tense on your resume. If you're discussing something that you're currently working on, of course, you'd use present tense. And if it's prior work or educational experience, you use past tense. And lastly, one item that I think is always helpful to include potentially can be some type of hobbies and interests. As discussed in the personal statement, we really want to know who you are. We want to know who you are beyond just your listing of kind of where you've worked and what you've done in those jobs and where you've gone to school and the grades you've received. So go ahead and list some hobbies and interests. Maybe you play golf, maybe you're a pianist, maybe you're an Olympic diver. Go ahead and include those on the resume. And at this point, I'll turn it over to my colleague.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Sarah Dorner, and I am with the University of New Hampshire Franklin Pierce School of Law. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you this evening. We are located in the state of New Hampshire. We're the only law school in New Hampshire, about 1 hour north of Boston, Massachusetts, and we offer specialized LL.M degrees. My colleague Hannah and I are going to be speaking with you tonight about addressing shortcomings. But before we get into that, I will let Hannah introduce herself.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm Hannah Keeter. I'm the Assistant Director of International Programs at the University of Minnesota. We all took about 10 seconds to introduce ourselves and our schools here today. Hopefully, you saw something on our slides that caught your eye, and you will join us in our individual Zoom rooms after we're done to ask us more questions about anything you saw in this presentation, on our slides about our schools, or anything else. So thinking about shortcomings, things that you maybe are not as confident about when you are applying. So as you're reviewing your entire application before you submit it, if there's any small part or big part, I suppose, if you don't feel 100% confident about, that might be a shortcoming. And one very key thing that Sarah and I want to emphasize is that make sure you're certain and you distinguish between, is it a matter of you're not meeting the requirements, or is it something that might be perceived by people like us on admissions committees as a perceived lack of demonstrated interest or maybe not being a good fit? So thinking about a potential shortcoming like a lower English score. At Minnesota Law, you need an 80 on the TOEFL to be admitted. So if you have an 81, that might be a perceived shortcoming for you. Maybe you don't feel great about that score, but you do meet our minimum requirements. If you have a 79, you're not going to be admitted. That's not a shortcoming. That just is a simple ineligibility factor there. Other things we thought about that might be perceived as shortcomings from an applicant's perspective would be a lack of work experience. Perhaps your grades weren't as high as you wanted. Things related to character and fitness, the honor code, academic integrity, that sort of thing. What we really want to emphasize is that you should be honest and transparent and tell us during the application process. If something comes up after you are admitted and enrolled, that can have really devastating consequences on your academic career. So if something happened that caused you to have low grades, tell us, be honest, and let us know what it was. We have students every year who come to our programs who don't have any work experience because they're young. That's not a problem. We look at your transcripts and see you just graduated. Some students might have no legal work experience, but lots of work experience because they needed to work to support their family, and the jobs they could get outside of school were not in the legal field. That's not a problem. Just tell us. Make sure you're communicating. The other recommendation I will put out there is to build a relationship with admissions staff, people like Sarah, me, everybody on this call, to have them understand you better. You can request an interview if it's not part of the admissions process. Even before you apply, you can request a meeting on Zoom just to explain a little bit more about your situation, get their perspective on what they think, and that will help you go through the admissions process more confidently. Sarah, what else do you want to share?
Thanks, Hannah. I will pick up right where you left off and add that in addition to connecting with the admissions representatives, it's always a good idea to connect with a current student or perhaps a recent graduate. This really helps to show us that you're interested and helps you to get to know us and us to get to know you in a different way, which I think will really help to offset any potential shortcomings in your application. Just another way to connect, show that you're really committed and that you're really interested and engaged. And I think that that really goes a long way in a successful application. That said, if you do still feel like there is a shortcoming, and what I'll do here for an example is talk about, some of us mentioned some of our programs have specialty areas. We talked before about maritime law or tax law or intellectual property law. If you are applying to a specialized program and you don't have any experience in that area, we might start to wonder if this is a good fit for you. So I think it's not necessarily a shortcoming that you don't yet have experience, but you would certainly want to take some space in your personal statement to speak to that, to tell us a little bit why you're interested in the specific fields of law, talk about some other things that maybe didn't come across in your resume or your educational experience where you maybe did have some exposure to this field of law, to know that you're interested in it, and really frame it as an area of growth. Tell us that you're pursuing this specialization because you need additional expert training in this field of law. So don't just gloss over it or pretend that gap isn't there, really name it. I think as Hannah and I were preparing this presentation, the two things that we kept saying were, communication is really important, and there's no such thing as too much information. So I think if you're wondering whether or not to share something, our recommendation would be to go ahead and share it. We'd rather know upfront and have a conversation with you about it. So I think using that personal statement as some space to explain any kind of gaps in your educational background, your professional background, or any concerns you might have, about, Hannah mentioned before, your English language score. You could say, listen, I only got an 81 on the TOEFL, but I'm taking this English course this summer. And I know that that's going to help, and I'll be fully prepared when I come in the fall. If there's something that's a little bit more involved, so perhaps your grades really suffered one semester, you might submit an additional addendum that gives us a little bit more details about what happened there. In the absence of information, we don't know. And so we might think you just kind of weren't really focused on your studies. But oftentimes there's a really legitimate reason. Perhaps there were health reasons. Perhaps it was the shift to online learning during COVID. Whatever the case may be, as much as you're comfortable being open and transparent about that, I think that that's a really helpful thing to do. And you are welcome to take some additional space and through an addendum to tell us about that. And at the end of the day, nobody's perfect. So really focus on your strengths, focus on the things that really make you a good candidate for the program, rather than focusing on those weaknesses. We all have them. So tell us what's great about you and why we should choose you as a student for our LL.M program. And I think with that, that kind of concludes. The next slide is really just contact information for all of us that spoke today. So you'll see our names, our school, and our email. And as Hannah and the others mentioned, please do reach out to us. We really are here to help and to answer your questions. As we said, there's no such thing as too much information or too much communication. So please do be in touch with us. And I think I'll turn it back over to Education USA now. And thank you all again for being with us this evening.
All right, so that was a lot of content. And I know some people asked us where would this recording be accessible for later, and I believe you will be sent the recording to all of the sessions, the access to the recording to all of the sessions if you registered, so don't worry about that. Now, looking at some questions that we can think about while some others come in, I was wondering if any of you can help us determine how to choose a good recommender. You know, what would be that criteria that one can think about when choosing our recommenders?
I'm happy to start if that's helpful. So I know many schools often, if you're kind of not been out of school for so long, many schools do look for at least one letter from a professor who can really speak to your ability to be successful in the classroom. A lot of our applicants have a number of years of professional experience and have been out of school for quite some time. And so it might be hard to get a recommendation from a professor. And we understand that. So I think, it's helpful to have professional references as well. And as the folks who presented earlier shared, you really want somebody who knows you well. If it comes across if they don't know you well, and then it makes us wonder, why, if they're, it doesn't send a good message about you as an individual if you couldn't find someone who really speaks to your unique strengths and abilities. So I'll pause there and see what others have to offer.
I would add that you also want to find a recommender that knows a little bit about how letters of recommendation for the US are drafted, because it's really much a different process for other countries. So that would be something that I would look out for.
I'd add also, as someone who writes these letters of recommendation for my students, make sure you thank your recommenders. So the first time that you ask them for this, they want to know if you're accepted and how things turned out. And if you appreciate this person enough to ask them to speak and vouch on your behalf, certainly it's helpful to maintain these contacts as you go forward in your career. So that's as easy as just sending a thank you note for having the person write you the recommendation in the first place.
And just to follow up on that, I think I would encourage all of you to think of this as continuing to build a network. It's much easier to write a recommendation letter for someone that has, sent me greetings when something relevant has come up in past years, as opposed to it's the first time they've contacted me in 6 years, and then they're asking for a letter. So try to use this as an encouragement to use your network and to maintain your network throughout the years, and that will make your reference letters stronger when they really know what's happened in your life since you've graduated.
I will actually echo that, Monica, because I had a mentor relationship with a student from my alma mater. And one of the things we worked on was a list of professors whose classes she enjoyed, classes where she was engaged in. She went to a school with a lot of big lectures. And so she was early on, if you happen to be early on in your career, we started kind of making a list of people that she thought, this was a class that I was well engaged in. This was a class where I really liked the professor and the subject matter. And then we made a plan for her to stay in contact with them. So at the end of every semester, she'd update them on how her classes went, what new classes she was enrolled in, as a way to kind of start building that professional network. So if you are early on in your academic career and thinking about an LL.M down the road, kudos to you for being this prepared, but start thinking about that as a longer term strategic goal. Like who in my network could be a good letter, a writer of a letter of recommendation.
If I could also add to, I really like it when students make this easy for me to do. So when they ask me if they give me their resume as well, I'll ask them if they don't already provide them, give me some talking points. What is it about you that makes you a really good candidate for this school? And so make it easier for your recommenders to get this letter drafted, because they are kind of burdensome to draft, and you want to do well for the student who's asking you to write it. But it's so helpful if you get a lot of information as the recommender as to what is your selling point, so that you could be most impactful for the student who's making the request.
And if you have your personal statement done far enough in advance, definitely share that so that it can be integrated into the recommendation letter itself.
All right, thank you. And I think also if some time has passed since you were in the same environment with your recommender, remind them who you were, remind them in which way you interacted, because we're all human, you know, we can forget. And I think that a little refresher can also help. One other question that could be a contribution is, what is the difference between a CV and a resume? Because we can see both of those things sometimes and we can get confused. Anybody want to help with that?
I have no idea. I never understood. I'll be curious what my panelists say.
So a CV is much more typical, and when I've seen it in an academic environment, so it's heading towards a PhD track or an academic track, where it's much more comprehensive and you would not be selective with a CV. So it's very typical for CVs to run on for 10, 16 pages, and that's an appropriate CV. But for a resume, you really want, as my colleagues shared previously, to keep it short and tight. So it's not the comprehensive draft of a curriculum vitae, which may be much more appropriate if you're considering a PhD program. But for law and for these LLM programs, keep it really tight.
Yeah, just to add to that, I always think of the resume being a kind of a shorter version that's typically 1 to 2 pages, depending on how long you've worked. And really, you know, I think there's some data, you would think about it similar to how employers look. I think they take about 20 seconds to do an initial scan of a resume. And so you really want to have your resume formatted and information kind of highlighted in a way that shares what you've done in a very concise way. And the idea is that there'll be other methods via interviews, via personal statements that'll draw out more of the details, versus a CV often captures all of those details in its initial format.
All right. So we didn't get more questions, but I wanted to highlight or give you a question that came up to me. I really appreciate how you explained the value and the importance of reading all of the information that's already available before you make a question that is already available to you, right? The answer is already available to you. What happens through your minds when this happens? You know, how does that break that first impression, and why is it so important for us to do our research and do our jobs as applicants? Anybody want to share an experience or something as we wrap this up? No?
I guess it kind of just depends on how basic the question is. Like, how far on my website do you have to dig to find the information? If it's information that's, you know, readily available on the admissions homepage, you know, that might rub me the wrong way. Oftentimes, if that happens, I will respond and I will give the information, but I'll basically just link to the website. And I think that then that actually gives them power to be able to, you know, dig a little bit deeper and learn a little bit more, as opposed to outlining the, you know, answer in full detail. I'm not sure if that answered your question or not, but that's
right. No, and I think it's just disappointing. Kind of, it starts the relationship on the wrong foot. At least it happens for us advisors. You know, when a student comes and asks a really basic question that is available in the web, then you're kind of like, oh, it's a bad sign. But yeah, thank you so much for everything that you shared. It was a really wholesome and big presentation. So thanks for all of your effort and your time. I have shared here in the comment section the links to the individual sessions to follow up with each of the representatives that joined us today. So feel free to copy them and paste them to have them available. And also make sure to reach out to them with any further questions on your application process. Remember, there is a session tomorrow as well. And yeah, thank you for joining us in this afternoon. I hope you have a great day. I'll stay here with the links open to give people time to copy them. But thanks, everyone. Good to meet you and see you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Maria Luisa.
Bye, thank you.
Hi, thank you.
Gracias.